Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's opening keynote. Please welcome to the screen our Public Art and Civic Design Senior Program Manager, Patricia Walsh.
And welcome to the second day of the Annual Convention and Public Art and Civic Design Conference. I am presenting today from Rockville, Maryland, where I live on land stolen from the Piscataway peoples by Europeans. As we begin, we are going to start with a message from Americans for the Arts President and CEO Robert Lynch, as he introduces a new partnership between the George M. Perez Family Foundation and Americans for the Arts.
Welcome, everybody, to today's keynote. My name is Bob Lynch, and I'm the President and CEO of Americans for the Arts, and I am delighted to be joining you all here today, and I thank you for letting me take a moment before the presentation starts to share a very special announcement with all of you, our public art family. I'm thrilled to tell you that today we are announcing our new George and Darlene Perez Prize in Public Art and Civic Design. It's a program and a prize. The program seeks to celebrate and highlight the work of individuals who support, who develop, who manage the incorporation of art into the design of places and spaces all across the United States. It includes a $30,000 prize that will be given annually on a rotating basis to an artist or a public art administrator or a representative from the civic design field to help them pursue their creative work. The prize recipient will also receive additional financial support to access opportunities to further learn and talk to folks, as well as independent involvement in dialogue and discussion about their work with national leaders in the arts and other allied fields. Very, very exciting. This program bears the names of internationally recognized philanthropists and longtime Americans for the Arts supporters, George M. Perez and his wife, Darlene Perez. And I know that I speak for the entire Americans for the Arts family in saying how grateful we are to George and Darlene for their tremendous generosity. George has a unique passion for creating vibrant urban communities. In his pursuit of building better cities, he has always brought the talents of artists and architects and pioneering designers to the fore. George and Darlene wanted to do something to empower the entire range of stakeholders in the public art process and to create a national platform to develop greater visibility and appreciation of the unique role that the arts play in shaping our experience of the built environment all around the country. We could not be more honored to be working with them in pursuit of those goals. The new annual prize is an important investment in the field, and we are privileged to be part of it. Americans for the Arts recognizes that public art not only plays a crucial role in designing the world all around us and creating a sense of belonging in public spaces, but also serves as an important reflection of the values of a community. This year, 2020, the Perez Prize in Public Art and Civic Design will be awarded to an individual artist. You can learn more about how to apply by visiting our website, www.americansforthearts.org/Perez Prize. Thanks again for being with us today, for being part of this family, and for allowing me to connect with you before our keynote. And so without further ado, I turn the virtual mic back over to Patricia Walsh, our Americans for the Arts Manager of Public Art and Civic Design. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Bob, for the message. And thank you again to the George M. Family Foundation for the support of the George and Darlene Prize in Public Art and Civic Design. Again, to learn more, visit americansforthearts.org/Perez Prize. And with that exciting news, we are excited to open this year's 2020 Public Art and Civic Design Conference, which starts now and goes until the end of the day. We have an exciting day of programming planned for all of you. I hope you all stick around after today's keynote and engage with the several sets of breakout sessions, an artist session with DC local artist group DC Dance Exchange, and come to an informal virtual hangout later today, as well as check out our resource center sponsors and exhibits hall throughout the day to learn more about those who are supporting us and engaging with us throughout this work. So without further ado, I will introduce today's keynote, Paul Farber. Paul is a curator, historian, and educator from Philadelphia. He's an artistic director and co-founder for Monument Lab. He is also senior research scholar at the Center of Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Farber's research and curatorial projects explore transnational urban history, cultural memory, and creative approaches to civic design. And now I turn the keynote over to Paul as he presents on power and participation, public art, and radical visions towards justice, repair, and regrowth. Paul, I turn it over to you.
Thank you and good morning. I'm Paul Farber. I'm the artistic director and co-founder of Monument Lab, and I'm speaking to all of you from Philadelphia, which is situated in the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. Philadelphia, from its colonial founding, was built and labored by enslaved Black Americans. And so I recognize in our conversation and our connection today that I'm speaking to you on stolen lands built by stolen hands. As we gather today to talk about public art, it's clearly an urgent moment, and it's a really important moment for us in this field and many others to be gathering. I want to thank Patricia Walsh, Krista Whaley, and all of the Americans for the Arts team for all of their help to bring us together. We were looking forward to being in person, but we're actually connecting in new ways here. And I also want to acknowledge the Monument Lab team, the curatorial collective, our artists, our fellows, our students who all contributed in their own ways to this presentation. Monument Lab is a public art and history studio. We started our work in 2012 in classrooms and have since gone on to produce citywide exhibitions, participatory research projects, and we work with artists, activists, municipal agencies, cultural organizations on unearthing the next generation of monuments. And my hope for today's talk on power and participation to talk about the radical visions and radical steps that we must take as a field to participate in the pathway toward justice, repair, and growth. As many of you are probably doing, we're encountering headlines by the day about monuments situated in the midst of a protest movement, an uprising led by activists in the movement for Black lives and fighting against systemic racism. The questions being asked across news outlets are ones that we and our collaborators have been asking in similar and in different ways for the better part of a decade. And it seems like every morning that we wake up, in addition to some of the most challenging and enduringly painful stories about systemic racism, there's something else happening, which is that activists, artists, and people working at municipal levels are no longer delaying justice in public space, urgently, timely, and profoundly taking steps. But of course, this is the debate right now. What do we do with our monuments? How do we think about our monuments as connected with, as symbols to our systems of injustice? And what are the ways that we respond? Lots of people are jumping into the fray, including some not so surprised guest commentators. And these kind of voices, like the one you see here on the screen, are trying to hold on to an idea of a monument that is no longer an agreed upon reality. The idea that monuments are timeless, that they are above us, that we should be beholden to them, and that somehow whatever the history that is represented in them, despite what we do know about how people with time, money, and power and investments in white supremacy built many of our monuments, they're trying to hold on. But they're too late, because for the better part of a decade at least, and especially over the last few years, activists, artists, and members of the public have remade profoundly the idea of a monument. Monuments are not left a way to be looked at from afar. They're places where you plug in, where you gather. Here, one of the most powerful scenes that we're encountering this month on Richmond's Monument Avenue continues to be one of dozens of sites across not just the former states of the Confederacy, but all of the United States and across the world. And here, just taking a moment to pause on this powerful image. In the background, we see the Robert E. Lee statue dedicated in the 19th century as a part of a segregated real estate campaign, and largely seen as untouchable by both decree and idea, has been taken over and transformed by protests led by Black and Brown activists, with other multiracial allies and accomplices gathering and joining in. And the writing on the monument is as if it's an inscription, changing the way that we think about the preciousness of marble and bronze. Surrounding this scene is small memorials to Black people slain by police, making sure to mark this as an important site of grief and also action. And of course, in the foreground, young people playing basketball in a much needed moment of release, of joy, of reset. This monument, if we think about it as a site of projection, again, points to us that monuments do not hold the meaning in of themselves. We bring to it the stories, the experiences, and the necessary shifts to reimagine them. There have been nightly projections in Richmond onto the monument. Here, a figure of Harriet Tubman, and with the initials of Black Lives Matter onto the horse of Robert E. Lee. We are reminded that in the United States, we have no national monument or memorial to slavery, to the sin, to the pain, and also to the legacies and continuities, the way that justice has spiraled, unfurled, and become entrenched as a part of de facto apartheid in this country. And what we're seeing now is not something just unique to American culture, but something that we know of in truth and reconciliation work around the world, that the ability to acknowledge suffering and fight through, and also to make both markers and other processes of repair are ways to connect the need for public acknowledgement with systemic economic forms of redress and repair. This moment to me conjures November 1989, where another piece of divisive infrastructure, the Berlin Wall, was toppled, dismantled, thanks to the work of East German activists who had organized to bring about reform. And this then we think about as another site in one sense where freedom became imagined on the very infrastructure that reinforced division, war, and the pain of the past. There are pieces of the Berlin Wall around American public cities, in presidential libraries, in public parks, in museums, as proof of, as symbols of history happening. And I want to put out there the idea that what we're seeing in Richmond, but across the country, are similar manifestations of history. There was no end of history in 1989, as commentators would write. Instead, it was the reawakening, the reimagining, the pivoting of history. As we are seeing monuments taken down, toppled, it is a profound moment that I want to kind of call out in a few different ways. One, anytime you see a monument that is being removed or toppled, make sure to understand that there are years of activism, of organizing, of artistic action that preceded the most recent removal of that monument. And even if there was a municipal decree by a mayor, a city council, or a public art office, part of the work that I want us to do as a field is to make sure to keep those stories of struggle, of activism, of organizing as a part of this new living art history of our monuments. Artists play such an important role in this process because before monuments were toppled, they imagined them as possible to move, to shift, to transform. How are we investing time and resources into artists to help us not just deal with what we know are the challenges of the day, but to anticipate pathways toward justice and repair? And finally, as we look at this moment of suspension, I want to talk about this as a moment, right? All of us, or many of us, are finding ourselves saying the phrase, this moment, in part because time feels abstract. If you already understood time as non-linear, this is not a surprise to you. But I think this narrative of monuments in particular as being endpoints of history, as opposed to points of continuation, of bridges, of eruptions, of things that show us the circularity of time, including systemic racism, but also the pathways toward contesting it and dismantling it. We want to acknowledge all of that as part of this point and place that we find ourselves in. Around the world, there are new approaches to dealing with and confronting our monuments that get away from not just the idea of permanence as our only option, but of preciousness. And there is glory in seeing monuments that have been raised to enslavers, to colonizers, to brutal leaders being toppled, especially by activists who have been pushing for such a long time to make this happen. Here in Bristol, the statue of enslaver and slave trader Edward Colston went into the nearby water and became a point of revelation as a counter to a bitter history of the transatlantic slave trade and the perpetuation of systemic racism. This is a symbolic act, but one that has resonated profoundly. And I think it's stirred many in the fields of public art, the multiple fields that we find ourselves in, to think about not just what we're going to do to commit ourselves to the work of anti-racism, but what do we have to stop doing that is upholding and perpetuating injustice through and in our monuments. There are people who've been called into action. A story of an Egyptologist who specializes in obelisks and tweeted out the instructions of how to tear down an obelisk went viral. And I think this is a moment where we can see that the work of scholars, the work of conservators, the work of people who often feel outside of the front lines can work in coalition with activists and artists on the ground. And this remarkable scene in the city of Birmingham, which had a boxed up base of a Confederate monument with this for the last several years, activists went and tried to take the advice of the Egyptologist to topple that obelisk. And the mayor of Birmingham said in early June, if you let me do it, I'll tear it down tomorrow. And this remarkable moment, the mayor stepped up to be able to absorb responsibility from forces at the state level who didn't want to see that happen. In my hometown of Philadelphia, where I'm based, we had one prominent monument removed to former mayor and police commissioner Frank Rizzo, a brutal leader who enforced and practiced police brutality that in the police force is continuing through this day. That monument was removed by the city and had been advocated to be torn down by Black and brown activists and artists who had been pushing the city to point out how much harm it was doing on the steps of our municipal building. But here, several miles away, another statue has started to draw national attention, and it's underneath this box. It is one of the city's two monuments dedicated to Christopher Columbus. One dedicated in the late 19th century, the other one and another site dedicated in the 1990s. Christopher Columbus never set foot in Philadelphia. After a group of white vigilantes started patrolling this monument with guns, with bats, and harassing protesters, the city decided to put a box around it in their goal to decrease tension. It has not stopped the tension. There were fights last night and calls for really a push around how police are allowing this to take place. But I want to also bring this up because one of the bitter ironies that we have in our city is that as of June 1st, our public art office was cut. a $4 million budget for a small office for a cultural fund that funds so many projects that deal with these very issues around our challenges of democracy and of belonging was eliminated. There are 2 employees that moved to the managing director's office. And I know I can't hear all of you at home, but I hope you're booing with me in this unacceptable moment. We need art to knit together our sense of connectedness in our democracy. We don't need to cut it. It already was devalued. How do we elevate art as central to this? But I want to draw attention to this sign. This is a sign that's very standard, and the box around this is very standard in the practices of protecting a monument from construction, or in this case, public debate. This is a sign that is calling attention to a process. And if you know anything about Monument Lab's work and my work over the last decade, we are all about process and experimenting and piloting new forms of process. But this is a moment where we need something else. And I want to kind of do a deep dive here into things that, you know, us at Monument Lab kind of try to pay attention to, and just kind of walk through it very briefly. One is just the first sentence. The Christopher Columbus statue has been a source, has been as a passive formulation. Who is doing this work? Who is responsible? Who is the city aiming to reach and speak to? The word controversy. One of my goals for myself, and I share it with you, is to try to watch for using the word controversy or controversial, and either eliminate it from our vocabulary or at least be really wary in the ways that the word controversy often serves white comfort at the expense of the pain and suffering over generations of Black and brown people. And just that word choice alone in the first sentence is pointing outward, as opposed to incorporating in to this question of struggle. The word appropriateness is here. This is a word that Monument Lab has played with throughout our projects. Our first research question is, what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? But I want to be clear that we borrowed that from municipal art language dating back 100 years, because the word appropriate means nothing on its own. It's about who uses it. And when it's spoken in this way, it comes across that there's some kind of inherent value to an appropriate place in a public park. And I'll talk more about it, but there are no neutral public spaces. This idea of listening to all, I think, is an important virtue, but as research has shown, public community meetings especially about design, privilege the voices of more affluent and white residents. And it's often the traditional form of listening. And there are other ways to really do deep listening. It might not happen in this notion of calling out a listening to all. And then finally, no decision has been made. Another passive formulation. Who is going to make the decision? How will the decision be made? How will it be funded in a city that doesn't have a public art office? I point all of this out to you. I know this is a mundane sign, but it's part of the mission of this talk today, which is I want us to really think about the things that often we've reserved as neutral or mundane or standard, and see them as the places for us to act and intervene in the field of public art. So Monument Lab is a public art and history studio. We are producing citywide exhibitions, participatory research projects. We have a fellows program with amazing memory workers and practitioners from around the country and around the continent, and now thanks to partnerships with the Goethe Institute and the German government out in Europe as well. But Monument Lab, to be very clear, started in a classroom. Myself and Ken Lum as co-founders, and our amazing team of artists, of curators, of researchers, of students who were thinking about the monuments that we've inherited from the past, and again, trying to unearth the next generation of monuments. And when we started this work in 2012, we felt like we were late to the game, because we're already seeing artists and activists pushing that connection between systems and symbols in their own cities. Seeing that if you have the time, the money, and the power to build a monument to something or someone that's important to you, you do it. But if you don't have the time, the money, or the power, you gather around a monument that exists to amplify your presence and make your voice heard. For us, we define monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And we say that because we want to account for traditional forms and representations of memory in bronze and marble. But we also want to look at some of the most powerful forms of representing the past and the living history of the present through performance, through poetry, through other kinds of inscription, and trying to understand the past, the present, and future of monuments together. Our process across different locations, from the classroom to the citywide exhibition or to a conversation with a public art officer or a group of fellows, generally follows this arc. We want to question. We want to dig into research about a statue, a site, or public space, and we want to think about that research in dynamic and creative ways. The archive and the library and the museum very well may be a space for us to get that research, but oftentimes it's talking to people off that page, in communities, in conversation, in the work of creating art where research happens. We aim to connect, to organize and exchange ideas with stakeholders invested in places of memory. And we see ourselves as conveners across different networks, institutional, and those on the grassroots level. We are trying to unfix monuments, to redefine this conversation about monuments and not understand them as permanent or static, but as places of activity and of dynamism. We prototype, we work with artists to build experimental platforms for contemporary art and participatory research, and then report out to share findings, reflections, and new directions for the field of public art. Among some of the projects, you can see more of them on our Instagram page or on our website. Here is a different kind of boxed monument, the 2017 project with artist Karen Olivier in Germantown in Philadelphia, where Karen Olivier boxed a Revolutionary War monument with a mirror in a neighborhood that was now predominantly African-American and working class. We asked how monuments reflect us, and Karen visualized that and made that actual, and it was so profound to see. And thank you to Americans for the Arts for honoring this project truly several years ago as one of the outstanding public art projects of the year. Here, a different kind of activation with the artist Manuel Acevedo and with our partners New Arts Justice in Newark and Rutgers Newark around a monument called Wars of America that is built upon the granite taken from Stone Mountain during the years of the construction of the Confederate monument there by artist and Gudson Borglum, who was also a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan and the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Here, the artist Manuel Acevedo, who had spent decades walking through the park and thinking about this monument, never permitted to climb it and experiment with it, created a performance piece called Cam Up as a way to study this piece in public and provoke the idea, again, that this monument is unfixed. We bring our best selves to it critically. And then our fellows program, which is meant to meet people and connect them in the midst of their work, often independent, sometimes with organizations. Here, an image by Alicia Wormsley from Pittsburgh of a project that she's taken around the world, the billboard, There Are Black People in the Future. And this is a project that reminds us that some of our greatest monument thinkers might be thinking about the new statues that should be built, but others are rethinking the idea of statue and making monument statements of power and presence in public. And our participatory research projects, like one we're doing in St. Louis with the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, which has a series of public events later this month that we urge anyone from St. Louis or anywhere around the world to join us, which asked people, how would you map the monuments of St. Louis? And we spoke to 750 people, and of course, the Arch was the most cited monument on their maps, but fewer than half of the people who filled out the maps included the Arch. It means that there are other sites of memory that might not take up an iconic space or even the air of our conversations, but are important to the stories of justice and belonging. And we share out this information through data, through reports. We have a bulletin where anyone, including anyone on this session, is welcome to pitch stories to talk about process and power and new directions for monuments. Over the last few weeks, it feels like we've compressed history. And in many ways, there is this circular motion and feel around time. Symbols that we have celebrated for countless years are being called into question, especially those that connect to legacies of enslavement, to police brutality, and other manifestations of systemic anti-Black racism in our country. And so this is a tough moment. And I imagine for many of you, as you are fighting for your budgets and you are fighting for time to be heard, and you're trying to figure out this tough work, whether you've been doing it for years or you're joining in the last few weeks, I want to just pause and acknowledge how difficult that is. And just to remind you that you are not alone in this. There are networks of some of the most remarkable, visionary, tough people around the country. Our fellows, people like Agunfemi Bangura in Richmond, Joel Garcia in LA, people who are already have put in that work. And so I want for those of us to try to find ways to support activists and artists and memory workers on the ground, and to make sure that the stories of struggle and of innovation that they have produced continues to be the way that we talk about and frame whatever comes next and whatever comes now. This is a map by NBC News, and you get a sense in one way of all of the kind of sweep here of monuments that will be removed, that were toppled, that are requested to remove. And I just want to say that no matter how up to date this news source and others keep, there's a wave of other spaces. And part of that is because how profound the memory landscape is entangled with the white supremacy landscape. Street names, schools, plaques, parks, historic markers, but also how they connect into systems. It is not a surprise that many Confederate monuments are placed outside of courthouses. There are reinforcing messages being put out here. It's not a surprise that the majority of Confederate monuments were installed during the time of Jim Crow and the movement for Black liberation. But let's push beyond that and anticipate what else. Where else, not just are we going to wait for critique, or that word I said to avoid controversy, so to speak, but instead be proactive and put into our plans the work for justice and repair. I was thinking back to the time before COVID-19, and I would travel a lot to cities to talk with practitioners or to think about projects. And I was thinking I would always go try to find a place where a monument had been removed and see what was left there. And I share these because I caution against the way that struggle has been erased from these spaces. Here, former Confederate Park, now known as Memphis Park, the site of the place of the Trail of Tears and the Choctaw Bluffs, and dedicated as a Confederate site in 1964. Activists, including the Take 'em Down contingent in Memphis and people like Tammy Sawyer, had pushed for this to change. And here, a blank slate didn't tell that story. San Francisco, earlier this month, I went to the site of the Pioneer Monument, which had included a depiction of a white missionary and a white settler above a native figure. And that statue was removed. And you could see here the early days left behind. We are at a crossroads of how to talk about the early days. And I point to this image as one that gives me more clarity. The intervention inspired by the powerful and essential 1619 project by the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones and a host of other collaborators. And this inscription was not sponsored by the city. In fact, it was removed by Charlottesville. And when I went in 2019, you can actually still see the outline. This kind of inscription is really important. It reminds us back to the work of activists like Ziona Bryant, who as a high schooler, a young Black woman in Charlottesville, started the petition to remove Robert E. Lee's statue and to confront the legacy of the Confederacy long before national headlines hit Charlottesville in 2017. I also think of the work of A Long Walk Home in Chicago, young Black women who have been organizing against violence, both in interpersonal violence and also against the state. And their long-term project, Say Her Name, Rekia Boyd Memorial. I'm proud to be a board member of A Long Walk Home and have A Long Walk Home's girlfriends be a part of our program. They are working for a permanent or a long-standing, I should say, memorial to Rekia Boyd, and the work is urgent. It continues. These are the people to think about and talk to in this moment. As I close, I want to go through a few ideas, a few mantras, a few thoughts, a few wishes for the field right now. And some of these are based on ideas that we've been talking about in Monument Lab for some time, and others are coming up in the moment. I encourage you to be thinking with me. And the first one is that there is no such thing as permanence in public art. Monuments have the aura of permanence, but we know they take maintenance and they take mindsets to hold up. How can we think about creating symbols that are long-standing, that reach across generations, but that are not framed as permanent? There is no civic institution that is permanent right now. We have to tend to our democracy day by day, year by year, generation by generation. Let's begin to think about permanence, thinking about it in another way, around prototyping, around testing, around creating research and engagement that pushes the idea away from permanence to other forms of survival and sustenance. A reminder, there are no neutral public spaces. If you want to look to amazing work in the field of museums, museums are not neutral. LaTanya Autry and Mike Murowski amplified a call that's gone around the world. And I think we should be really thinking about this for our public spaces. We hear monuments should just go to a park or a museum or even a cemetery, as if those spaces don't have legacies of segregation embedded in them. So how do we, instead of trying to find a neutral space or neutral ground, acknowledge the past and the present and try to imagine public spaces that are not built around white comfort and safety or the hyper-policing of Black and brown people, and advance new forms of possibility? The Design as Protest movement is a great place to start. One of our fellows, Dee Nichols, and our close collaborator and friend, Brian Lee, are among a large group of people to be thinking about these issues. Your tools include budgets, maintenance, inventories, conservation. And I did not put here signage and interpretation, because that's not enough. Your value system lives in your budget. And I know that many of you are fighting for every dollar you have, but I want you to be thinking about how you utilize both financial and in-kind resources, or even just the place that you have, whatever power you have. You have to start with your budget, and you have to think about how money is spent and channeled through your projects. Maintenance. Here's my request, public art administrators and officials. I want you to take any money that is spent on the maintenance of monuments that are known as perpetuating racism and marginalization, and I want you to put it toward new artwork, new processes, and compensate Black and brown artists and LGBTQ artists as part of that, and move that money. And hey, if your maintenance money technically lives in the Parks Department or in the Public Works Department, what about working with them and calling attention to them and creating alliances? It's not enough to just put your hands back and say this must be maintained. Similarly with inventories, we are always trying to think about what the monuments are in our cities. I hear it from public art offices all the time. What if you added a category that this monument is dedicated to someone who benefited from the institution of slavery, or you asked students to gather as opposed to just experts? This is foregrounding work. And finally, conservation, to rethink what monuments have to be over time. We can gather them as part of our history, but they're only a sliver of it. So what are other ways we can push this conversation? I want us to balance presence and absence. And here, an image by a Monument Lab fellow and artist in Baltimore, Ada Pinkston. We have profound grief and loss that we are balancing in public, no matter how much we are proud of and triumphant with. And what we hear from artists all of the time is balance presence and absence, so that you are accounting for what is lost, and also not just thinking about that in the past, but understanding loss and grief as part of a living approach to history. Consider returning the land and plan accordingly. And I say consider returning the land, and I don't just mean it rhetorically. I actually want you to feasibly look into this, that monuments are part of systems of settler colonialism, of gentrification. And so what would it mean to consider, or what would it look like to consider repatriating a public park or even the site of a monument to a local indigenous tribe that was dispossessed of their land? What would it mean to confront the legacy of Monument Avenue, a project of white segregationist real estate, and thinking about housing as part of the memory work that we do? This is a big ask, but I think it is potentially an area that we can really think about, and art can lead the way for other sites of reckoning and of reimagining. And then finally, work in coalitions to connect symbols and systems of injustice, or of justice, and symbols and systems, again, as knotted together. We have to listen, we have to learn, we have to hear what's been happening for the years preceding this moment and the years that will continue. And of course, we need new initiatives and new programs, and we're excited to get to work. But we also need to stop doing the things that have caused harm in the first place. We can't have the same process that gave us our last generation of monuments, or our several generations of monuments, and have different outcomes. What we can do together, it is challenging, it is tough, but it's worth it. And the importance of transformation, to take modes of public art being frozen, of being static, and instead reimagining public art as pathways toward transformation, toward repair, toward justice. This is the power of public art, and we are working to find our ways within our own cities and across cities to change the way that monuments live today. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul. I really appreciate, and I know from the comments I'm seeing, people really appreciate your comments in your speech today. I'm really excited. We have about 2 minutes left of the session, so we don't quite have a lot of time for conversation. Is there a way to continue the discussion with you, Paul, moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Really eager. We've been excited to hear from some of you folks before the session and hopefully after. So if you can follow us on social media, monument_lab. You can listen to our podcast. We have amazing folks that we speak to, and new episodes coming about what's happening on the ground now. And you can get that Monument Lab podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, and go to our website, monumentlab.com. You can sign up for our mailing list, but even more, you can get involved, because there's so much happening in this world that's been building for so long. And so this is a place to pitch an article for a bulletin, or to ask a question, and maybe just connect that we are stronger together and we can do this really important work.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Before we leave, I am going to read off one of the comments that's sort of one of the top kind of quote unquote rated. It's sort of an interesting system we have here for the questions that I think is just important to read and acknowledge. That is written by Mr. Jordan, or Mrs. I shouldn't assume, Jordan Carter. This looks very nice for mega rich funders, but it is devoid of any association to real systemic change aside from knocking down a statue. Removing monuments is an artsy distraction to really attacking the root causes of racism. As a Black man, this isn't healing, but coping. Simply because the Black people who spray paint these monuments and help take them down will still have to avoid prejudice and police brutality on their walks home and every moment after in America. It is, quote, symbolic, unquote, to do this monument removal, but that is similar to the president being, quote, unquote, symbolically impeached and still able to be up for re-election to inflict further harm. Artists and arts administrators, please fight to get to the root. You have the power to make real progress, love. So I think this talks to a lot about what you're saying at the end, that we really need as a field to really come together to really make some real systemic changes in how we do our work and moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, and for the important reminder to push and to really, forge that ground and recognize the work between symbols and systems, and just take a moment with those important words.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for everyone. Thank you, Jordan Carter, for your comment. Thank you, everyone else. I know it's a lot of great questions there, but we're out of time. Please do follow up with Paul online, through social media, etc. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you join us for the rest of the day for our sessions as we have them come out, or if you're not able to attend today, be able to watch them later. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely, lovely rest of the week and rest of the day. Thank you.